You're audible.
Hello and good evening, everyone. I Urvi Makwana from Medical Humanities at State GSMCN KEM Hospital present you an event, How to Read a Poem by Sitanshu sir. So, down the course in medicine, we have somewhere lost touch of the emotions of people who form the core of our practice. The Division of Medical Humanities believes that it is important for medical professionals to understand the human not only from its physical aspects but also in social, emotional, cultural, and mental aspects as well, through which can be through fine arts, theater, music, literature, philosophy, etc., to promote a human attitude towards the patient. Also, poetry is a form of literature that uses aesthetic and rhythmic qualities of languages to evoke an emotional response. And it provides an additional meaning instead of the normal prosaic meaning. And the current pandemic has forced us to remain confined in the four walls of our home, losing the physical connection with the world. Hence, to keep ourselves busy, to keep ourselves protected from the negativity, we adopted different ways of expressing our emotions, which would be a first time for many of us. So, poetry is one such form of expression. Now, poetry is such a form of expression. Hence, we medical with the medical professional people of the medical fraternity are presenting you with an event. Now, before I would like to hand over to Dr. Karthik sir. So, Dr. Karthik sir, who is an alumnus of State GSMC, also known for starting the film club even before medical humanities in State GSMC was formed. And I would like to say that sir forms an excellent link between art and science. So, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Urvi. We are thankful to Manu Bhai, to give us this kind of an insight. And I think we are the only medical college with a chair of humanities. And I hope that we do develop into a department of humanities. So, let us go ahead with the subject for the day. Ours is a very demanding profession. We need to maintain very high standards of competence, as what we do or what we do not do has huge implications affecting life. We need to balance personal and professional life. In the profession, we need to balance science and intuition, ethics and morality. We walk the razor's edge all the time. We deal with disease, disability, despair, and death every day. We see people in the most vulnerable state at times when they feel everything is lost. We see people in their most basic nature, the raw, savage form without any pretensions. We are also in a position to see the indomitable human spirit, resilience of the human mind, body in the face of adversities, and witness the will to live in the darkest hour and celebration of life in the shadow of imminent death. This is where the humanities come in. In spite of disease, disability, despair, and death, a curious physician wonders at the human spirit. As Puja Nathalal Joshi says, when a physician sees the brain functioning and the heart pumping, he slides into the world of wonderment and he forgets himself. This self-forgetfulness leads him to divinity, the thread connecting all beings. Tagore says, Aache dukha, aache mrityu, birah dahan lage, tabu ashanti, tabu anand jage. तबु प्राण नित्य धारा हाशे सूर्य चंद्र तारा बसंत निकुंजे आशे विचित्र रागे तरंग मिलाए जाए तरंग उठे कुसुम झरिया पड़े कुसुम फूटे ना ही क्षय ना ही शेष ना ही दैन्यलेश शयी पूर्णतार पाए मनस्थान मागे दुख है मृत्यु है विरह की दाग मुझे जलाती है तभी भी शांति है तभी भी आनंद है तभी भी अनंत जागृत है प्राण की नित्य धारा अनंत चलती है सूर्य चंद्र तारा हंसते हैं वसंत निकुंज में विचित्र रंग से आती है तरंग उठते हैं तरंग मिटते हैं फूल झड़ते हैं फूल कर्मा जाते हैं। यहाँ क्षय नहीं है, शेष नहीं है, दैन्यलेश नहीं है, there is no dearth, there is no decay, there is abundance everywhere. इस पूर्णता के चरण में मेरा मन स्थान मांग रहा है। Humanities makes a physician humble to approach the world and his patients with empathy. Poetry is an evolved art form. I asked a few friends what poetry means to them before this program. A few of them said, poetry, nonsense. A few of them said they don't understand poetry. One friend says that I don't understand the meaning between the two lines. And this response, and most of them said that they don't have time to understand or appreciate poetry. Most of us do not wish to put in efforts and have either the patience or the willingness to understand poetry. We are bombarded with direct messages, so well camouflaged by the marketing media that we do not perceive them as manipulative. We as a society have disregarded the arts in the blind pursuit of material sciences. Consciously, we have discouraged our children from the study of humanities and the arts. We have encouraged generations to become accountants, engineers, doctors, but never artists, musicians, or poets. Whom should we blame? Anyway, it doesn't matter. So that brings us to the topic for the day. Let me share a story with you of Leo Leone. There is a family of mice who stays on the edge of the village, on the outskirts of the village in a stone wall. The winter is approaching and everybody is busy gathering whatever crumbs of food, grain, and the corn they have. Everybody works except Frederick, who sits on the wall and looks at the sunset and the sunrise, who swims in the streams, who climbs the trees and looks at the flowers and the fruits. And when everybody tells him, why aren't you not working? He says, I'm working. It'll come to you at the right time. The winter approaches. They are confined to their hole. It's gray outside and cold, extremely cold. They're very happy, chirpy. They enjoy themselves, they eat their food. But over a period of time, they're dejected. The food is over. It's cold and dark. Then somebody remembers, Frederick, you said you had gathered something for the winter. What have you done? So he climbs on the stone, asks them to close their eyes. And he talks about the sunsets and the sunrise, and their hearts are filled with warmth. He talks about the chirps and the streams, and they are full of movement. He talks about the colors, and they are happy. And then they said, Frederick, you are a poet. And he says, humbly, yes, I know it. In order to understand poetry, we need to read it first. And who else but a poet can tell us how to read a poem? So let me introduce Sitanshu Yashchandra. Now, from our childhood, we've been hearing singer, not the song. But I believe that it is the singer and the song, both are important. The poet cannot be separated from the poetry, and the poetry has no identity without the poet. The kavi and the kavya are important, but what matters to me, what attracts me most is the kavya tattva or the poetic element. Now, I'm out of my depths in introducing Sitanshu Yashchandra. Muhammad goes to the mountain all the time, but here the mountain has come to Muhammad. And this Muhammad has no clue how to describe him. Kabir comes to my help here. Kabir says, कबीरा एक कुआं है पानी भरे अनेक कबीरा एक कुआं है पानी भरे अनेक भांडा ही में भेद है सब में पानी एक कबीरा सब में पानी एक. Kabir talks about the unity, the oneness, but here I'm talking about small vessels or containers of varying capacity. The difference is obvious. So I present to you what my small mind sees. Sitanshu Yashchandra is not just a poet. He's a university. He's a poet, he's a playwright, he's a critic, he's a translator, he's an academician, a teacher, a public figure, a thinker, and much more. Now, when we describe a poet, let us look at his biography and then we'll look at his work. He completed his master's from the University of Bombay in 1965. In 1970, he went to the US under the Fulbright Scholarship and completed his PhD in comparative literature. Then he went to France under the Ford West European Fellowship, where he studied, translated in English, and did a comparative study of Ionesco and Shakespeare's Macbeth. He also completed his second PhD in comparative literature in 1977 from the University of Mumbai. He married Anjani-Ben in 66. His first daughter. His daughter was Vipasha, was born in 1971. And that was not just a struggle, but it was a war. And I think Vipasha was a spastic child. Both Anjani-Ben and Sitanshu Yashchandra worked on her now and made her an individual. And that is what they wanted her to be. So now she has an independent existence. She has an individual by itself. She has done a master's in philosophy and she's a poet in her own right. I think that and they chancellor of the Saurashtra University for 3 years. He's a visiting professor to the many universities abroad and Jadavpur. He's an emeritus professor in the University Grants Commission. He was appointed
Karthik sir has left. Sir will join in a few minutes, sir.
lost the link on my computer. Am I audible now?
Yes, sir, you are.
Okay. So every 10 years, he published a book of collection of poetry. Then his poetry, the first volume called the Odysseus nu Halesu came out in 1974. 86, he published a book called Jatayu. Let's not take it. Every 10 years he's been publishing a book of poetry. He's written many plays. One I like the most is called Amanas Madrasi Lage Se. Another is called Kem Maganchi Kya Chalya. He's written the screenplay for the film Maya Memsar. He's written books on critical theory, and he's adapted plays of Ionesco, Thomas Hardy, and Peter Shaffer's Equus. He's a recipient of every possible award that you can think of. But the important ones I would want to mention is the Sahitya Academy Award, which he won in 1987, the Ranjit Ram Suvarna Chandrak in 87, and the Padma Shri in 2006. Now, this is as far as the stature is concerned. Now, let me talk about the person. I'm in no position to talk about his work, but I can definitely share with you how I found him and how I see him. These are the impressions of the 14-year-old at 60. I discovered Sitanshu Yashchandra as a teenager. We were in school. We had just started reading poetry, and Sitanshu had published his first book, Odysseus nu Hales. As teenagers, we were developing our own individual personalities, would question everything, and had a clear sense of right and wrong. We were in no mood to accept things, especially authority in any form, would challenge everything, and were ready to take on the whole world against us. In Sitanshu, we discovered a rebel and somebody we identified with, a voice we could identify with. We found a poet who had an independent mind, who saw things differently, who had problems with the system and was ready to challenge the current notions. In one of his poems, he says, "रंग महल से हाथी निकला, हाथी पर अंबाड़ी रे, उसमें देखो बैठी कैसी जात हमारी आड़ी रे, टेढ़ी रे, और उसमें देखो बैठी सीधे नहीं पर टेढ़े हैं." This टेढ़ापन is what attracted us. And we know for sure that he's a non-conformist. He uses a large canvas with lots of obscure allusions, from Odysseus and the oar, to Treta Yuga and Jatayu, to Mohenjo-daro and Ho Chi Minh or Che Guevara. He uses surreal images which excited us. He used allusions and allegories we sometimes understood and identified. Each of his work was a door to something bigger and deeper with layers of meaning. I remember Mark Strand here. He says, "I have a key with which I open the door. I have a key with which I open the door. It's dark, I walk in. It's darker, and I walk in." That is how we perceived Sitanshu. He uses day-to-day language and simple construction to bring out the most complex ideas or arguments. Let me quote something from Jatayu. He says, "Vanano lilo andhakar je kahe tem sab kare, fare, chare, rati kare, garbane dhare, avtare, mare." So these are not great translations, but every animal obeys the green darkness of the forest. They roam, graze, copulate, conceive, deliver, and die. He was more than ready to experiment and push language or expressions to its limits. Ho Chi Minh is a daring example of extending the limits of poetry. His poem on Ho Chi Minh is something which I would like to read for you. In this poem, a sentence is broken down into words. Words are broken down into syllable and sounds, reflecting the oppression, suppression, and the human suffering. Let me read it out to you. This poem goes in 4 movements. The first movement, the tank advances. Tank kahu kach dale tore, bank taku tach hade tote, hank talu kakakeda toche, hank tank kach dank tonka ha. The second movement, tank victorious. Kale dato touch kalahu, tankata, 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 tankata. Dato kale chat kalahu, tankata, tankata, hanka tonka kach danka tonka ha. The third movement, man's suffering and the joy of lethal attack. Tank kale hu tachada to hu tete re he he chu che 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 tankata hanka tonka chada ha to e. And the fourth and the last movement, the tank retreats. Kahukach hakuhach hakuhach kakukach kahukach hakuhach hakuhach kahukach. This, to my mind, is an extreme example of experimentation, and I love it. He raises questions about self and identity. sense of limitation and alienation. His play, A Manas Madrasi Lageche, is about being different, about identity. It reminds me of Badal Sarkar's Evam Indrajit, UNESCO's Rhinoceros, and Kafka, of course. Now, this is my Sitanshu Yashchandra. This is how I see it. And now you will discover your Sitanshu Yashchandra. I present to you Sitanshu. The literary world is celebrating his 80th birthday. And this program is his return gift to us. Sitanshu bhai, I've had enough. I hope you accept it. And that window is all yours.
Dr. Karthik, whatever I wanted to say, you have already started saying it. So, that is really the first point about how to read a poem. Just as my talk today has begun by what Dr. Karthik has said, it is not as if the talk will begin now, it has already begun. Similarly, as you read a poem, you realize that the first line of the poem is really not the first line. As you read a poem or listen to a poem carefully, you realize that there are so many things that have been expressed even before the first line begins. And when the last line ends, the poem doesn't end, it continues. So this kind of anadi and ananta quality, which you ascribe to Brahma or God, Shiva, for example, anadi and ananta, I think every poem worth its name begins before it begins and doesn't end where it ends on a piece of paper. So this kind of, so where does it begin and where does it end really? I'm not saying something mysterious or kind of fashionable. Make a statement of fact. So the text on the piece of paper has its beginning elsewhere. Where does it have its beginning? For example, and we'll come back to this poem, Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. So the first line is, let's go then, you and I. The evening is spread against the sky. So it's a romantic kind of poem. The evening is there, and the two lovers, one lover tells the other, let's go then, you and I. The evening is spread. कितनी शाम अच्छी निकली है, चलो हम घूमने जाए, आदि आदि. And then the third line, which doctors are listening to this. So the first line once again I will repeat. Let's go then, you and I. The evening is spread against the sky like a patient etherized upon the table. So the patient etherized upon the table has been cut up by the surgeon and the blood is coming out and so on. So the evening is like that, like a patient already on the operation table, already the body has been opened. So where does this poem begin? Let's go then. So then is the word. The key word is not evening and so on. It's then. So there is a conversation already on before the first line begins. And that conversation is in contemporary modern civilization. So all our evenings have become, instead of Wordsworth's evenings, T.S. Eliot's evenings, in the sense that there is violence and disillusion, and we'll come back to that poem. But it's not just modern poetry which has its beginning before its beginning. One of the poems that whole world is singing is Narsi Mehta's Gujarati poem, popularized by Gandhiji, and now mass media has Vaishnava Jana to Tenere Kahiye. So, first reading it would seem that this is a list of virtues that a man of God should have. Peed parai jane re, par dukhe upkar kare. Is it a list? We feel it is a list because we begin the poem at the first line. But the very third word of that first line, if you listen to it carefully, Vaishnava Jana to tenere kahiye. So this to is often missed out. So there is already a conversation going on, and it gives list of Vaishnavajan. You should have tila tapka, you should be devout, you should take bath every now and then, and so on. So Narsimata negates that. In Hindi would say, ये तो ऐसा है, यानी ये ऐसा नहीं है. So that poem begins again in its own past, of cultural past, and it negates, it interrogates, it questions a past. So this sense of beginning before beginning, and then when the poem ends, sort of the reader thinks about it and feels it and continues. So let me interpret this introduction by Dr. Karthik as the real beginning of the talk, and suggest that the originary moment of a poem is not in its first line, but it is in a much larger kind of reality, inner and outer, political and social, psychological. All those realities are there from which the poem kind of originates, and the originary moment is not in the first line. However, let me formally kind of begin my talk. Uh, how to read a poem. So, dear and respected doctors and students at the Division of Medical Humanities, which is a very interesting idea. Division of Medical Humanities, set up in memory of revered Dr.M.V.L. Kothari at the GS Medical College and KEM Hospital. So, dear Dr. Karthik Bhagat, Urviji, Darshji, Mrinmayji, and other distinguished doctors, students, and friends. You all have gathered today in this virtual space to figure out, with a bit of help from me, how to read a poem. I must make it clear at the outset that I am one of you, though of course not a distinguished medical doctor, but in the sense that I too have not quite figured out yet how to read a poem. So I don't come here as an expert. But my first submission then is that unless a poem compels you to take a break from reading it on after you read a first few lines, unless it compels you to stop, unless it baffles you through some kind or the other of its own ambiguity, there is no fun reading a poem. A poem is not a good wife who makes your years of marriage so good. A poem is a girl that eludes a young man seemingly for eternity, but the girl who manages to keep that young man busy in a desperate pursuit. So it is not settling down. Poetry is not settling down in a good life. Very often we expect literature to comfort us and to sort of make us settle down in life. So didactic poetry is very often the only kind of poetry that we like. So poetry is not that's only a part of the whole thing. In fact, the least exciting part of the whole game of poetry. The more exciting part is the desperate pursuit. So Rajendra Shah says, Sansare mujhe mugdha brahman panshu malina vishi. I move around in this world with my clothes which are dirtied by the dust of the earth. So this dirtying of the cloth, not moving like an army in glorious uniform, but poetry is that kind of adventure which is a there is an element, unless there is an element of desperation, there is no poetry. You, you really want to make some sense of this life. And all other disciplines, everything else, it gives you order in life, but doesn't quite give the sense or the significance of the excitement of life. So this is the first point that I would like to make. And good poets are there. Kamal is there. So what am I saying? You already know. But let me still. Uh, so moving from poetry to novel and theory of novel. Uh, so there is a Czech novelist, Milan Kundera, you know. So he has a book called A Book of Laughter and Forgetting, in which he describes a scene. He says, in February of 1948, the communist leader Clement Gottwald stepped out on the balcony of a Baroque palace on Prague to harangue hundreds and thousands of citizens massed in the old town squares. A revolution has taken place, and the leader of the revolution, communist leader Gottwald, has come out on the balcony to address the huge crowd which has gathered there. That was a great turning point in the history of Bohemia, a factual moment of the kind that comes only once or twice in a millennium. What happens in the balcony? Kundera describes Gottwald, the great communist leader, revolutionary leader. Gottwald was flanked by his comrades, with Clementis standing close to him. Clementis is another leader, next leader. It was snowing and cold, and Gottwald was bareheaded. Bursting with solicitude, Clementis took off his fur hat and put it on Gottwald's head. The propaganda section made hundreds and thousands of copies of the photograph taken on the balcony where Gottwald, in a fur and surrounded by his comrades, spoke to the people. On that balcony, the history of communist Bohemia began. Every child knew the photograph from seeing it on the posters and in school books and museums. However, something happened. 4 years later, Clementis was charged with treason and hanged. The propaganda section immediately made him vanish from the history and, of course, from all photographs. Ever since, Gottwald has been alone on the balcony. Where Clementis stood once, there is only bare space wall. Nothing remains of Clementis but the forehead on Gottwald's head. So this is what language of propaganda, language of rhetoric, language of mass communication, which has taken place of human language today. This is what this mass language does to our reality, psychological and political, internal and external. What does it do? There were two leaders, and Gottwald, the main leader, was bareheaded, but Clementis, his friend, his comrade, out of love, he put his fur cap on the leader's head. But then Clementis was pushed out, as so in all power struggles this happens. So his image was removed. But the fur cap, his fur cap, Clementis' fur cap, was in Gottwald's head, it cannot be removed. So it is there. So what does poetry do? Now we have two sets of languages, language of rhetoric and language of poetry. Language of mass media and language of personal talk, which is poetry. Language of poetry that you have to read points out to not to the absence of Clementis, who has been destroyed. How does it do? By pointing out to that cap has not been removed. So we have this huge balcony and huge town square of all political and economic and religious leaders of our own times, 21st century. They have taken over human language. And but something remains in the language of poetry of 21st century also. And that is that fur cap. That fur cap is something that you have to read when you are reading the poem. If you know how to read absence, only then you can read a poem. So what has been so reading poetry in 21st century or at any moment of crisis, which goes on recurring, where public life has taken over private life, where political and economic and religious forces have taken over independence of individual and society and people. It's at this point of crisis that reading of poetry comes in. So, options. Poetry presents you with the option of looking at the absence. So, how does that happen? Let me take a very short poem by Gujarati poet Hasmukh Pathak. Most of you probably Gujarati speaking friends know it. So I'll first read the poem and then you tell you. The poem is a short poem. આટલા ફૂલો નીચે ને આટલો લાંબો સમય ગાંધી કદી સૂતો નથી. Gandhi has never slept covered with so many flowers and for so long. This poem has been written after the poet visited Rajghat in Delhi. So Gandhi is there, and all political leaders and everybody comes there. Such a nice, shiny stone underneath which is there in Rajghat, and so many flowers. But Haspuk Pathak says, આટલા ફૂલોની છે ને આટલો લાંબો સમય ગાંધી કદી સૂતા નથી. So you start listening to the poem. What is he saying? Why does he say this? So he probably, imagine the poet, he's surprised that, oh, Gandhi is sleeping for such a long time. Gandhi is covered under so many flowers. I can't believe. And that I can't believe, that is the poem. You have to read that. You have to read that unspoken word, something that has preceded the first word, Atla Folo Niche, and something that will continue, Gandhi Kadi Suto Nathi. So, what is the poet telling us? He's probably telling us that I don't think that is real Gandhi, which is underneath that shiny black stone of Rajghat. You have appropriated him. The real Gandhi would never sleep for so long. He would go from Satyagraha to Satyagraha, and even after independence has been won by India and Pakistan, he would go to Noakhali, and he was planning to go to Punjab, East Punjab, Pakistan, telling people not to be so violent, not to be so mad, not to be so inhuman. So who is sleeping here? It is a Gandhi that you have appropriated. So the poem, you have falsified Gandhi. This surely cannot be Gandhi. I know Gandhi. Gandhi is not this. And when you read this poem, you realize that this abduction of Gandhi, this appropriation of Gandhi is so widespread. It is happening right now, today, in Ahmedabad, in Gandhi Ashram. So this appropriation, not only of Gandhi, but then this poem prompts you to think, how many things we have appropriated? Have we appropriated Subhash Chandra Bose also? And not only our times. Have we appropriated Ram or Christ or Muhammad? What are we doing in their names? So the poem, if you read it, this is how the poem kind of explodes in your face. And poetry reading, then you realize it's not such a peaceful act. It's an act of courage because it makes you confront some realities which are hidden by political, religious, economic forces above all. And economic forces have this whole meta language of advertisement, of propaganda, and so on. So there's a small little haiku which I would like to read out to you. This is not by Basho, but by Basho's pupil, Katsushika Hokusai. Not a very well-known person, but a very good poet. And you must discover unknown poets as you go on reading. Because well-known poets sometimes repeat themselves. They've exhausted themselves. You must always discover newer voices in your language. So this is kind of, Basho, not Basho, but another haiku poet. His lesser known poet. So then he would have a voice which would be fresh. And look at this poem by Hokusai. He says, I write, erase, rewrite, erase again, and then a poppy blooms. At the end, nothing else. A poppy blooms, a little small little flower blooms. Nothing great happens. But before that, I write, erase, rewrite, erase again, and then a poppy blooms. So this is how a writing poem is oftener not writing a poem, or if you have finally written it, erasing it. This erasure is a very important part of any creative act, not only writing poetry, but any creative human act. If you go on writing the same like a child in the first standard, you have to Gujarati में के एकड़ो बूटो. So someone has written figure 1, and then you write on it. So rewriting is not the point. When you read a poem, you must erase that poem and kind of write a new poem, which relates even Kalidas to your own time. So that brings me to the third point. So what is written and why has it to be erased and why has it to be rewritten till the poppy finally comes out? The point is that the language of mass media. Hello, can you hear me? Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay.
Loud and clear.
So now there is a dialectics between the abstract and the concrete. While the whole world of advertisement, it goes on repeating itself. It's such natural, but you go on saying Amitabh Bachchan and everybody else, selling something or the other. Who is not selling now? It's a scary situation. All our popular people, cricketers and film stars, everybody, they're selling some product, and all the jingles and all the seemingly creative writing.
Is this going to be also downloaded later on YouTube, you think? So then I'll just watch it from the beginning whenever. This is like I've just started halfway through.
Just please mute yourself.
Okay.
Sorry, Sitanshu bhai.
So okay. So now disruptions and this is a part of any living conversation. This means that I'm not lecturing.
No, there are people around.
So good, there are people around. They're interrupting. They're disrupting. So this kind of living language and dead language. This is what we are talking about. Reading poetry is restoring life to a language which has been robbed of its vitality by, But why are they selling so many things? Somebody sells what? Clothes. Somebody sells shoes. Somebody sells some paint. So many things. And everybody's selling. And no one is ashamed. It's a shameless world of language. So you have to restore some shame to your mother tongue. Your mother tongue. कबीरा खड़ा बाजार में लिए लुकाटी हाथ, जो घर जा रहे आपनो चलो हमारे साथ. What is he saying, Kabir? Where is he standing? Kabira khada bazaar mein. That is the point. The poet has to take his stand in bazaar because it is there where language has been reduced to non-language. So Kabira khada bazaar mein. So how do you restore its vitality, its life, its truth to language? Liye lukati haath. जलती हुई मशाल नरसी के हाथ में भी थी वही. And you have to burn yourself. जो घर जा रहे आपनो चलो हमारे साथ. So much has to be destroyed. And not only the bazaar but your own home also, because bazaar has come to your home. And this is the crisis of language in our own times. And so I write, I erase, rewrite, erase again, and then a poppy blooms. So how does this happen? How do we restore uh, language to its vitality. And how do we read? Unless you read poetry, unless doctors and engineers, Kamal is here before me, engineer, and so many, unless all the professionals read poetry and really read their own poetry, there will be a great crisis in our culture because it will be a culture of selling out and sold outs. And we have to be, there is a lovely anecdote of Balwant Rai Thakur. He was a great Gujarati poet, but very huge and very heavy and with huge mustaches. So once another young Gujarati writer, Kishan C. Chawda, who lived in our Vadodara, from where I am speaking, so Balwant Rai Thakur had come from Bhuj to Vadodara, and the young writer, Kishan C. Chawda, took him to a famous gathering, a commercial gathering of Baroda, which is called शुक्रवार की गुजरी. वो गुजरी जो है वहाँ वो मिलते हैं, सब कुछ बिकता है और बड़ा commerce place. So they were both walking, and a young man, a jovial Muslim boy, young man, he comes and looks at this Balwant Rai Thakur, who looked very odd because he had a sola hat and a loose-fitting coat and so on. So the young man asked Kishan C. Chawda, "Aa cheez vechwani che? Is this also a part of your Shukrwari Gujarati, Gujri? Have you brought him here to be sold?" Everybody thought, this Kishan C. Chawda thought that Balwant Rai Thakur would be most annoyed and angry. But as a poet, and poet in Bazaar again, like Kabir. So again, Balwant Rai Thakur, he says, he looks at the young man in his eye and says, "Aa cheez vechai chuki che." This has been sold, but sold to no commerce, sold in no market. Balwant Rai Thakur was sold to Saraswati. He was sold to himself. He was sold to poetry, and not for resale. This kind of stand a poem takes in contemporary or any market economy, political economy, religious economy, and that's why doctors and engineers and professionals should read poetry. And the only medical college which has such a forum, and it's a matter of great happiness. And what Dr. Karthik is doing, all the young colleagues are doing, is something of immense cultural significance for India today. Read poetry. It would make you ask questions. So there is a poem by a Malayali poet, K. Sachidanandan. I'll read it. It brings us back to Gandhi. The Gandhi has been appropriated by all of us. So Gandhi and poetry. One day, a lean poem reached Gandhi's ashram to have a glimpse of the man. Gandhi, spinning away his thread towards Ram, took no notice of the poem, waiting at his door, ashamed at not being a bhajan. It's a new poem, modern poem of our own times. It's not a bhajan. And he was standing at Gandhi's place, and I was feeling slightly ashamed that I should have been a bhajan with Gandhiji. No. If you want to stand at Gandhi's doorstep, you don't have to be bhajan. That's what the poet is conveying here. But the poem was a little bit ashamed. The poem now cleared his throat, and Gandhi glanced at him sideways through those glasses that had seen hell. So Gandhi looks at the poem, not sideways, and through his own glasses. So Gandhi asked the poem, "Have you ever spun thread?" He asked. "Ever pulled a scavenger's cart? Ever stood in the smoke in the early morning kitchen? Have you ever starved?" So Gandhi's questions to poetry are Sivya, have you ever known life? He asked. Vaishnav Janato Tenere Kahiye ki Peed Parai Jane re. Have you ever known Parai Peed? And this is a Malayalam poet making Gandhi ask these questions. How you see this poem, before it began in Narsi. So then the poem continues. When Gandhi asked the poem, have you done all these things? The poem said, I was born in the woods, in a hunter's mouth. A fisherman brought me up in a cottage. Yet I knew no work. I only sing. So now we are baffled. What is the poem says? I was born in the woods, in a hunter's mouth. It is Valmiki. Valmiki is the hunter. And in the woods, Ma Nishada Pratishtatvam Agama Shashwati Sabha. So Indian poetry was born in the forest, in the mouth of a hunter. A fisherman brought me up in a cottage. It is Vyas, Mahabharatkar. So Indian poem is also a match for Gandhi. Gandhi asked him, have you done all this in a scavenger and so on? He said, no, I was also born by a hunter and I also know life in my own way. And I do no work, I only sing. But the poem is introspective. So he says, first I sang in the courts. Then I was plump and handsome. But now I am on the street, half starved. That's better, Gandhi said, with a sly smile. But you must give up this habit of speaking Sanskrit at times. Go to the field, listen to the peasant speech. The poem listened to Gandhi. There's a dialogue between the two. And each one holds on his own. That's what the dialogue is. And then the last lines of Sachidananda's poem. The poem turned to a grain and lay waiting in the fields for the tiller to come and upturn the virgin soil, moist with new rains. So each poem, as you read, must turn into a grain, into a seed. And each poem should be buried into the soil of your own reality, or your own mind, your own crisis of language. So Mira says, Asuvana jala sincha sincha prema beli boi. To read a poem is no childish task. A poem should turn into a kernel. A poem should turn into a seed. And it should grow once again from seed to a plant, from seed to a tree, in your own mind. Virgin soil, that's why he says. Moist with new rain. So a reader should have his own ecosystem. Rains don't come unless the sea boils. So to be a reader of a poem is it involves all this. And that's what we are here in this extraordinary forum, which brings medicine and literature, sciences and poetry together. So all the different human faculties, human endeavors, they're to gel together so that a whole man or a whole society or a whole people could take place, where the state is not separate, the economy is not separate, the religion is not separate from the society and from the individuals in the society. So So it is not seeking of comfort, but a desperation, as we said earlier, a desperation, because we are in a, especially in the 21st century, a very peculiar stage of human history. Uh, so this, who could know this? Because it's not easy not to seek comfort from poetry. Medieval poetry, as we understand today, is comfort giving because it posits an absolute. God is there who would take care of everything. But the actual medieval poets were never comforted by God. They were always faced with crisis. So we misread Bhakti poetry. We read it exactly the opposite of what the poets probably meant. Because Mira never said that, God is there, he will take care of everything. He said, Vishaka Pyala Rana Jiye Bheja, Bejo Mirabai de Haat. That is the first line. Hari Churana Amrita Kari Pi Gaya, Mira, take it, okay. But every single great medieval Indian poet speaks of great crisis in his life. Narsi Mehta goes on speaking of one crisis after other, religious, political, economic. Harsaven Apado, economic crisis, or political crisis. Hundi, economic crisis, and so on. So, this, but we are tired little human beings. And especially these doctors, they go on working so hard. Anytime they could be called. So they're tired and they don't want to really want the poem to lead them to one more struggle, one more effort, one more crisis, one more saving of life. I understand. But that is it. You must gather more strength somehow. And poetry would give you that strength from inside. Because there's more strength in each person than he or she realizes. She or he realizes. So there is a woman poet, Wisława Szymborska, from Poland. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Poland. But let me first we want consolation from poetry. We want comfort zone finally. God is there. Such nice lines. See, like Tarak Mehta Ka Ulta Chashma, and everything ends so well. There might be a little problem here and there, some quarrel here and there, some mistake here and there. But everybody is a caricature of man. And we like caricatures, we like simplification. And at the end of it all, you have to sort of, it should be good. And that's why Tarak Mehta Ulta Chashma is looked at by everybody. It's such a popular long. So let us have semiotics of Ulta Chashma. Tarak Mehta was a different person. These episodes are not written by Tarak Mehta himself. Tarak Mehta had a sense of irony. That's why he said Ulta Chashma. But Ulta Chashma we have made Sida Chashma. And this comfort-giving serial. And this is not the only one. All in the television serials and everything around us. All the speeches of political leaders and religious leaders. All the katha and so on. Are huge, so much money. From where does this money come? Poetry should make us ask this question. So, consolation, Szymborska. The title of the poem is Consolation. Darwin, they say, he read novels to relax. Darwin, they say, he read novels to relax. Dr. Karthik told us that his colleagues say that they don't want this poetry, they have so much work. And if there is some kind of literature with which they could relax, they would rather read that and not all this poetry stuff. So Szymborska knows that because he is an excellent poet. So she says, and he refers to Darwin, the arc scientist. Darwin, they say, he read novels to relax, but only certain kind. Nothing that ended unhappily. If anything like that turned up and raged, he flung the book into the fire. True or not, I'm ready to believe it. His story about Darwin might be true or might not be true, but Szymborska says that I like to believe it. Scanning his mind so many times and places, he had enough of dying species, just as you doctors also have. You have enough of dying species. The triumphs of the strong over the weak, the endless struggle to survive, all doomed sooner or later. He had earned the right of happy endings. Darwin had earned the right, after all this hard work, to happy endings in novel, at least in fiction, with its diminutions. Hence, the indispensable silver lining. The lovers united, the families reconciled, doubts dispelled, fidelity rewarded, fortunes regained, treasures uncovered. All these good things should be in a novel. Stiff-necked neighbors mending their ways, good names restored, greed daunted, old maids married off to worthy persons, troublemakers banished to other hemispheres, forgers of documents tossed down the stairs, seducers scurrying to altars, orphans sheltered, widows comforted, pride humbled, wounded healed over, prodigal sons summoned home, cups of sorrow thrown into the ocean, hankies drenched with tears of reconciliation, general merriment and celebration, and the dog Fido and the dog Fido, gone astray in the first chapter, turns up barking gladly in the last. So this kind of literature we want. And poor Darwin, he has earned the right to have this kind of literature. So why do you give to Mr. Darwin novels not of good ending, but novels like James Joyce's Ulysses or Kafka's terrible novels of so many tragedies and so many, upsetting. And Szymborska is all the time laughing at us, laughing at Darwin. This is what you want after doing so much research in science, after knowing so much about life and evolution. All that you want is to be comforted by literature. And this is hard on Darwin to ask him not to ask for novels of good ending where the dog Fido, lost in the first chapter, comes back barking happily in the last chapter. But we want that. And that is the crisis of reading of poetry in our own times. So then what do we do? Do we just order the reader to kind of, brace for the pain of reading poetry? Is this what we want to say? Not at all. That's not the point. The point is that this reality which is challenging us, we must have a way of dealing with it. And that is where Freud once again comes in. So, in a book which is, I think it was posthumously published, Jokes and their Relationship to the Unconscious, or Wit and its Relationship to the Unconscious, where he says the superego is so harsh and is controlling everything so fully that it's very difficult to challenge it. If you go and challenge it directly, it will destroy you. Look at Afghanistan. Look at any other country, not only Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the most obvious. Others are subtle, but they are all the same. All countries are more or less Afghanistans. So what happens if you challenge the rulers? They destroy you. So Freud says it should be done through humor, through laughter. And modern literature is really it provides you with a peculiar way of laughing it away, and challenging the forces and asserting your independence and your own authority on your own life through laughter. So let us see a little bit of what is this peculiar black humor of modern literature. Let me turn to a haiku once again, because that is the most distilled of, unless it is, just pranks, but it is a genuine short poem. Short poems are the most distilled form of human language, because throughout this evening we are talking of crisis of language, crisis of human language. So there is a poem, it's called Autumn Evening. So the coming of the night, an autumn night, difficult night. So how do you perceive it? It says, on a bare branch, a crow has alighted, autumn evening. So you see it on a bare branch, all the leaves are gone, withering of life. And what happens? A crow has alighted. A crow has come from somewhere and sit there. And then the poet simply says, autumn evening. So the night is coming. But the poet is looking at that night as this crow. And this crow is, after all, not so frightening. So you laugh at the whole night by saying, okay, all you are, don't try to scare me. You are a crow. You are just alighted here. And I know that the tree is bare. It doesn't matter. I'm looking squarely at you. So this kind of sense of defiance, sense of defiant laughter is there in modern poetry. And so there's a poem called Man with Blue Guitar by Wallace Stevens. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So there are demands on poetry that tell us how it is and don't go into this laughter and, like guerrilla warfare. That's why I wrote those poems on Che Guevara and Ho Chi Minh and so on, the guerrilla warfare, the laugh and dance and so on, defiance, full of laughter. So you must sing upon the blue guitar of things exactly as they are. That's what the man of blue guitar, the man of imagination, is told by the masters of mass media, that you must tell exactly as they are. Ideologies. They see reality in their own way. Left would see reality in its own way, right would see reality in its own way. And they would tell poets, writers, and they are doing it today, even in India. They would say, you must sing upon your blue guitar of things exactly as they are. So what do you do? What does a writer do? What does a reader do? So the reply of the man of blue guitar of Wallace Stevens is, things exactly as they are changed upon the blue guitar. So this defiance, and it's so light-hearted. It says things exactly as they are changed upon the blue guitar. What can I do? You are telling me to look at reality and history and everything through the eyes of communism or eyes of capitalism. But I can't do that. I'm a poet. And when you read a poem, it liberates you from looking at realities through points of view of ideologies. So liberation of language is the first. So what kind of language then is this? So why are all the small languages disappearing in throughout the world today? And there is a Armenian poet. Now, Armenia has disappeared as a country. It was there, but with this reorganization of the Second World War, its parts have been absorbed in different countries of Central and Eastern Europe. So this Armenian poet has Ishkhan, Moshe Ishkhan. And what happens to his language? No one speaks his language, because if he goes and lives in America, he has to speak American English. And if he goes to France, he has to speak French, Germany, German, and so on. So where is his language? His country is not there. So no language. You know that in Kashmir, the official language of Kashmir is Urdu. So this is what's going to happen to Kashmiri language also. When their own state has not accepted their own language as the mother tongue is not the state language. So this is what is happening to all the languages. The mother tongues are turning into state languages. The languages of emotions are becoming languages of power. And this is a crisis of reading also. Reading of poetry, I'm not here to tell you how to read nice lyrics and how to read nice comic poems. That's not the point. Armenian. So the title of the poem of Ishkhan is the Armenian language is the home of the Armenian. Armenians have lost their homeland. So now they have to keep their language alive. Armenian language is the home of the Armenian. The Armenian language is the home and heaven where wanderer can own roof and wall and nourishment. Ownership. The Armenian language is the home and heaven where the wanderer can own roof and wall and nourishment. Wanderer. these people without a country now. And there are so many. They are not the only ones. He can enter, if he makes his language his home, he can enter to find love and pride, locking the hyenas and the storms outside. For centuries, its architects have toiled to give its ceiling height. Think of your own mother tongue, Marathi, Gujarati, Hindi, any other. For centuries, its architects have toiled to give its ceiling height. Our contemporary Gujarati has low ceiling now, but Narsi and Ramanand have raised and Gandhi have raised its ceiling. How many peasants working day and night have kept its cupboards full, lamps lit, ovens hot? Not only Narsi and Pramanand and Gandhi, several other writers, minor writers. How many peasants working day and night have kept all cupboards full, lamps lit, ovens hot? Always rejuvenated, always old, it lasts centuries to century on the path where every Armenian can find it when he is lost in the wilderness of his future or his past. Wilderness of our future. Think of it. It looks very rosy, but how it is really? It is only poetry which would tell us that after the end of a poem, when the poem continues in the mind, in the heart, in the spirit of the reader, it points out to a future. And not it's the future is not utopian. It could be it's a peculiar juncture of history in which we are living. So every Armenian can find if he makes his mother tongue his home. That is the challenge. Are we making our mother tongue our home? No. I was recently, some years back, I was invited. Now I'm invited to inaugurate all sorts of things. So I was in. Hello. Once again, am I lost or can you hear me?
You are there very much, loud and clear.
Okay. So this is another issue that confronts us. I was asked to inaugurate a school. I said, "What is the name of the school?" He said, "Saint Mira." I said, "Saint Mary?" He said, "No, sir, not Mary. Mary is Christian. This is our own." I said, "But who? Saint who? Our own." He said, "Saint Mira." Is it Sant Mira? No, sir, this is English medium school, so it's Saint Mira. So, so the Saint Mira schools have been inaugurated by all sorts of in all sorts of towns and villages of India. So is Armenian the home of the Armenian people? Is Gujarati the home of Gujarati people? Is Marathi the home of Marathi people? No. We have found, we have bought homes in high-rise buildings. And these homes are English for us. So when you read a poem, of course, but how many of us can read poems in any language for that matter, but in our own mother tongue? And Karthik was reciting from Bengali. Wonderful. Indian languages. It's not necessary that you restrict yourself into your mother tongue. When I was asked once, what do you think of Gujarati and this and that? They thought I would praise Gujarati to the sky. I said, my Gujarati is not my prison house. My Gujarati are my wings. So Gujarati could lead to Marathi, of course, next door. We are all bilingual in Bombay and in Baroda also. And we could be multilingual. Indians are natural multilingual people. So when we read poetry, it's not the technique of reading poetry that I'm trying to sort of convey, because somehow obnoxious of me to teach you techniques of reading poetry. That's not the point. Why read poetry? That is the point. Why instead of how? So this why is this Armenian? Do we so not utopia, but mother tongue? So are we able to make more than at least one mother tongue we should have, but more than one also is a so. But what does a poem? What does a poem describe? Which is very popular in India. And there is a definition of poetry in India. It says Darshanat Varnanat Cha. The poetry is poetry because it has darshan, and after having this darshan, you have to do varnan after visualizing, great things. You then describe it. So I treat the word darshan in a kind of not a very poetic way, but very medical way. So you ask a, a philosopher what is darshan, who says six darshanas and so on. You ask a doctor what is darshan, he says you look carefully at the body of the patient and see the symptoms. So I like to interpret the word darshan in this particular way. And let me read a poem which again most unusual poem, very difficult to kind of understand when you have first reading. It's by William Carlos Williams, an American poet, a contemporary of T.S. Eliot, but he hated T.S. Eliot because T.S. Eliot was very grand, very kind of, darshan, yeah, Om Shanti, 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 and so on. Uh, William Carlos Williams is a very different kind of poet. And here is a poem, The Red Wheelbarrow. He describes in this poem a wheelbarrow, a cart which is used by laborers to carry load from place to place. Wheelbarrow. And this is a short poem. The red wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain, water, beside the white chicken. And that is the end of the poem. When this was first published, contemporary of T.S. Eliot, on one the wasteland and great where Walt Whitman tradition was there, T.S. Eliot tradition was there. Here comes a courageous poet with this same small poem, The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater besides the white chicken. So why so much depends? Why so much depends upon just a wheelbarrow? He's looking it from his window, and it's raining. There's a wheelbarrow downstairs in the courtyard, and he says, so much depends. Why so much depends? What has happened? What is happening is, how do you read this poem? So here is a poet who has taken out everything else from our vision, and he makes us see only one thing, and that is this wheelbarrow. But this wheelbarrow is not a concept, it's a thing. It's not an ideology, it's a perception. It's a concrete thing and not an abstract ideology. And this concrete thing, how is it? A red wheelbarrow glazed with rain water besides white chicken. So there are two other things. The wheelbarrow is there, but it's raining, and the wheelbarrow is wet with rain. And some chicken are, running around. So he sees that also. So seeing this is almost like a doctor looking at a patient. When doctor looks at the patient, He looks at the body, physical body. Things are to be watched. Then, of course, the stethoscope is there, and then the X-ray is there, and everything else is there. But first, the doctor's eyes and the patient's body, and the doctor's nose or ears and touch the patient's body. There's a very spatial relationship. And I think that is the spatial relationship of a poem with reality. A poem is unmediated vision, not mediated vision, unmediated vision, direct contact with reality. Thinginess of uh, thinginess of uh, the image, and if that is understood, then the whole notion of darshana would change, and then the whole notion of varnana also changes. So you don't look at grand things and make major statements and say grand narratives, and that is rejection of grand narratives is one thing that modern poetics has taught us. We move from the epic to the small poem, because in that small poem there is more freedom for the reader. So this wheelbarrow, it leads us to a whole new uh, way of reading a poem. For example, there is a Polish poet, Anne Swor, and she describes Warsaw during the Second World War, where it was under double attack, first by the Germans and then by the Russians. So when your own city is under attack and is burning, what does a poem do? What does a modern poem do? And how do you read that modern poem? And so the title of the poem is I'm Afraid of Fire. So there's no grandstand. It's human response. Your city is burning and you're afraid. You're afraid of fire. But then what do you do with your fear? And that's what your poem teaches you. And that's the last point that I would like to present to you. It's already 8, and we are we'll continue for a while because we started late. But this is the last point. What does a poem lead to? The teleology of a poem. What does a poem lead you to? After it ends, where does it continue? And so, what do you do with your fear? What do you do with your anxiety? The modern times are not times of comfort, but you have to face them. And what do? First, I'm afraid of fire. That's the title. The short poem, it continues. Why am I so afraid running along the street that's on fire? Why am I so afraid running along this street that's on fire? After all, there is no one here, only the fire roaring up to the sky. And that rumble wasn't a bomb, but just 3 floors collapsing. Set free, the naked flames dance, wave their arms through the gaps of the windows. It's a sin to peep at naked flames, a sin to eavesdrop on free fire's speech. I am fleeing from that speech, which resounded here on the earth before the speech of man. I'll read this poem. It's a short but extremely dense poem. It speaks of the language of fire, the speech of fire, which was there before the speech of man. And it asks itself, why am I so afraid of this? After saying that I'm afraid, let's read this poem again and see this whole question of language, which is in Indian tradition, literature is called Vangmaya. Vangmaya means think of language. So it is not a thing of emotions, because poetry is often seen as an outpouring of emotions. And let's be more, humane. Let's be more emotional. Let's have more feelings. That's not the point. Poetry in our own times is not a place where we go to become sentimental. It is a place where we go to figure out what are we going to do with these terrible sentiments that are there, which we cannot escape in times of fear, in times of anxiety. How do you deal with it and be human being, be independent, be creative? So let us read this poem. I'm afraid of fire. Why am I so afraid? Running along this street, it's on fire. After all, there is no one here, only the fire roaring up to the sky. And that rumble was not a bomb, but just 3 floors collapsing. She sees a whole building collapse before her own eyes because of fire. And she says it's good that it is not a bomb. Only a set free, naked flames dance, wave their arms through the gaps of the windows. It's a sin to peep at the naked flames, a sin to eavesdrop on free fire speech. And that is the point. All the advertisements, all the speeches, all the katha, all this false language, enslaving language with which we are surrounded in 21st century Vadodara, 21st century Mumbai, 21st century India, 21st century Afghanistan, whatnot, America, everywhere. There's a language which looks like human language, but it's language of power. Naked flames, they have their own existence. It has become independent of human life. That's why some philosophers, some critical thinkers say that this is post-human period of culture. This is post-truth period of culture. So what is this post-truth, post-culture? Because all the ideologies and institutions have grown beyond our reach. UNESCO is a good thing, UNO is a good thing, World Bank is a good thing. But it's absolutely out of control of human beings. And all the war machines, everything, all our constructs, human constructs, have become post-human realities beyond our control. And that's where a poem like this says that this fire has its own language, and this fire is dancing. This fire is it's a language of fire, and it says, don't forget, this is not only post-human or post-truth language, it's also pre-human, pre-truth language. That's how reality was there. It says, before the speech of man, I am fleeing from that speech which resounds here on the earth before the speech of man. So poetry is preserving speech of man. And another speech which looks like human language, but which has become absolutely unhuman language, which is so attractive, which is so good in all advertisements and all so on, so luring. So the lure of the language of fire and the call of the language of poetry. So these two are before us. And what do? We are not equipped to listen to the language of poetry. And the lure of the language of fire is so good that it appears as if it's the language of the rains. It's not the language of the rains, it's the language of fire. But we don't, it's so, they're so, it's so powerful. It has trapped us. And that is the reading of poetry as I understand. I tried to place before you. So let's, in conclusion, let me go back to two simple poems. One is by William Wordsworth, and that is really, if our poetry reading has stopped at school, in high school, and then we have not done much poetry reading, this is something that would link us to what I have been trying to tell you between these two languages, language of the fire and language of poetry. So this poem is simple. It could enable us to distinguish between what is language of fire and language of poetry. What is this mass language of deception, of appropriation, and this other language, private language, personal language of poetry, which is personal language not only of the poet, but also each reader. So Wordsworth, William Wordsworth, dear old poet who is not so complicated. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. What a lovely line. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. That is good. But then he says, I'm paraphrasing it a little bit. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So it was when I was a child. So it is now that I am a man. So it be when I grow old, or let me die. Now this let me die, terrible statement coming from Wordsworth and not from Kafka or Sartre or Camus. Wordsworth says, or let me die. Why? Why this crisis suddenly? Because my heart leaps up when I behold the rainbow in the sky. It should leap up. And the sky should be full of rainbows and not this fire coming from there. On the not this crow which is alighting on the withered tree of the terrible night that is before us. But should be rainbow. Why not a rainbow? But unless your heart leaps up, the rainbow doesn't come down. So that's what Wordsworth is trying to tell us. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. And so it was when I was a child. When I was a child, my heart leapt up and the rainbow also felt like coming down. So it was when I was young. When I'm now a man. So it be when I'm old, when crisis, when I confront death. And at that time, if I see a rainbow, my heart should leap up. Doctors would say that if the heart leaps up so much, there's going to be trouble. You may have a heart attack. This young man, actor. But the poet doesn't mind, he doesn't mind dying if you can live eternally, so to say. If you could live in this moment and eternally, which is the same. If you live in this moment, you live eternally. And the only way a human being can live eternally is to live in this moment. So even when you're old, when you're confronted with death, your heart should leap up. That's what Wordsworth is trying to tell us. And that's what poetry means. Child is the father of the man. That's why he says that child is the father of the man. So it is the child which gives birth to the old man. And the old man should look at the child not as his progeny, but his originary moment. So we have been talking of the originary moment of poetry. And Wordsworth, in his simple poem, tells us child is the father of the man. It has been described in so many ways, interpreted in so many ways, this particular line. But it is a simple line. Wordsworth is a simple poet. And he says, child is the father. Then that's how the old man, facing his death, would look at the rainbow and still, like a child, forgetting his death, defying his death, laughing at his death, his heart would leap up. This is the laughter of modern poetry. Wordsworth was, one of the earliest poets who left the old language of ornate language of poetry and used common language, common English language for poetry. So that's why he is also an early modern poet in this particular sense. So this laughter of modernity, this laughter of the psychologist Freud. So it can happen only when the child is the father of the man, and so this defiance that poetry teaches us of all the powerful forces. I'll conclude this presentation before you, this informal, intimate presentation before you, because how else do you talk about poetry? Not in a formal way, in an intimate way. Poetry is a place of intimacy with yourself, with the world, where the defenses are down, when all the pretenses are gone, and this unmediated vision, and language becomes not language of power, but this language of spontaneity. Because a poem is not written unless it is written spontaneously. Every poet, whosoever has written a poem, knows that you can't plan that this evening I'm going to write this poem. No, you can't do that. So this language. So Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock, with which we started, we would end with that also. Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock. The laughter of the title, you must have smiled at it, because love song should be of Romeo and Juliet, Shiri and Farhad, Radha and Krishna. But here the poet says love song of Alfred J. Prufrock. First of all the surnames, Prufrock, love song of Prufrock, and also not just Prufrock, it should be Alfred Prufrock. But no, not Alfred Prufrock, Alfred J. full stop Prufrock. So you must read this poem just as you must read Vaishnava Janat To Tenere Kahiye. To. You must read that To. You must also read this J. Poets, are peculiar fellows. They tease you by saying something so softly, and they are testing you. Are you hard of hearing, or do you hear poetry well? Then you will hear To and you will hear J of this poem. Alfred J. Prufrock. Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock. So he says to his beloved, this young man tells his beloved, let's go then, you and I, when the evening is spread against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. The third line changes the whole thing from a traditional romantic poem into a poem of our own times, where the patient is waiting for us, etherized upon the table, and it has been cut up. The reality is also before us. The evening is before us. The evening where the crow has alighted. Let's go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, streets that follow like tedious argument of insidious intent to lend you an overwhelming question Oh, do not ask what it is. Let's go and make our visit. We have come out with our, these two young people have come out, lovers, but they have nowhere to go. Half deserted streets are there before them, and tedious streets which follow each other like tedious arguments are there. So when you go into into this reality through this love song, what kind of world is the question? So what is the question? Oh, don't ask what it is, because the question cannot be given to you. The question has to come from the poem, within the poem, not given by the poet, but taken by the reader. So the old kind of thing, where the poet was the master and the reader accepted everything from him. Even in Tagore, Tagore is too full of, advice. But the modern poetry does not do that. The absolute, the perfect, the eternal, so dear to Tagore, are not available to us. Our truths are not eternal truths, tentative truths. Our truths are not applicable everywhere. Truth of one place becomes a lie in another place, and you know it because of the master narratives, because of the other use of language, the eternity and timelessness. So we live in fragmented times in fragmented places. You have to unite them. You have to somehow put everything together. It is our own effort. So don't ask what it is. Let's go and make our visit. So make our visit. Now this make our visit in this particular context of the doctors would be very interesting because you go and make your visit and you do not know what kind of illness has grasped, has taken grip over your patient. You have to find out. No one is going to tell you. It's a new patient every time you make a visit. And that's what modern poetry tells you. That you go out, make your visit. Don't ask what question. You ask the question to all the symptoms. What is it? What can ail thee, night at arms, alone and palely loitering? So that is another kind of poetry, but here is another kind of poetry. So Eliot, this poem, I'm not going to read it fully, but he says, "For I have known them all already, known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons." So this reduction of life to smallness, where all the measures of life are coffee spoons, small little things. And that is what we have to confront. That our life is not just a coffee spoon, it's a coffee cup, much vaster, much greater challenge. And our small little measures are not there. And then you remember Kalidas, Purvaparo to yadhim vikahya, Sita Prithvivyam iva manadandaha. This Himalaya is with one foot in Eastern Sea, another in Western Sea. There is one in Atlantic, one in Pacific, so to say. And it is there as the measuring rod of the whole earth. So this epic poem was also telling you to measure vast distances. And this modern poem is also telling you the same thing, that don't use coffee spoons to measure out life. And then the poem continues. And would it have been worth it after all, after the cups, the marmalade and the tea, among the porcelain, among some talk of you and me? Would it have been worthwhile to have bitten off the matter with smile, to have squeezed the universe into a ball, to roll it towards some overwhelming question, to say, I'm Lazarus, come from the dead, come back to tell you all, I shall tell you all. If one settling down by her pillow, a pillow by her head, should say, this is not what I meant at all, this is not at all. These two young lovers have gone into a small little hotel, shady hotel. They have done whatever they had to do, and the woman is lying on the bed trying to adjust the pillow. And these other questions, I'm Lazarus, come from dead, come back to tell you all, I shall tell you all. And the woman says, I want to rest now with the pillow. And this is not what I meant at all. This is not at all. I have not come to you for all this. But Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock involves all this. Reading poetry in our own times, present times, involves all this. We cannot have a comfortable pillow over under our head. Lazarus has come back from the dead, and the death is all round in Warsaw, flames, and each city is Warsaw. Flames might not be apparent, but they are there. But with courage, with fortitude, with insistence, hut, hatilapun, and with the sense of humor and defiance, modern poems could still could still um, lead us to a world which could, to a language which could be our mother tongue, a language that could be our home. We have to occupy it. So reading a poem is like reclaiming our own home, which has been taken over by other languages. I'm not referring to English language because we are trying to learn English language because it's a language of power, language which leads us to riches. That's why we are not reading English language of William Carlos Williams or T.S. Eliot. So our mother tongue has been, our home has been taken over by other languages, languages of power, languages of politics, languages ultimately of economics and rhetorics. So, as we said earlier, there are two options, rhetoric and poetics. So, in this world where the language of rhetorics, language of power, has occupied our home, we must reclaim our home and go there like Armenians and discover that our home, our mother tongue, our Gujarati, Marathi, Hindi, Kannada, Bengali, the ceiling is very high. We need not live under this false ceiling. The mansion is very vast. There are many mansions in my father's home. So many people could come. It is this vastness that is ours, has been produced by our predecessors. And we must not let other language occupy our own home. I think there are not many fora today uh, like the one which has been built in memory of Manu Kothari, who united the language of knowledge and the language of heart so well. And this thing that Urvi and Darsh and Minmay and above all Dr. Karthik Bhagat, like his father, Mahendra Bhagat was a very dear friend of mine. And in our own little Kavilok, which was also like this, right in the middle of Bombay, in Chira Bazaar, we had a Kavilok, land of poetry. So this is what Karthik is now doing. land, a home for poetry in the compound of a famous hospital. Now, this is very exciting. So, I thank you, Karthik, for inviting me to this home of poetry in the compound of KM Hospital. And uh, I always intend to come to your home as a reader of poetry, and hopefully not as a patient.
No, no, no,
But
no, no.
even if I do gaze at this body as a reader would look at a poem in its thinginess, in its and let's look at our sick reality of our own times, which has been infected by this COVID, which is much more than a virus or much more than in this COVIDness of our own times. So thank you very much and have a good time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sitanshu bhai. Whenever we meet, we won't meet. Poetry will meet. It is you and I when the evening is spread out against the sky. So it's been a pleasure to have you here. I don't know. I think it's been very, very enlightening. You painted a very wide landscape, and I think you've raised a lot many questions. I don't know what we started with, and I think that is the beginning of poetry. So all of us will carry this poem with us. It's always, we've always had problems with abstraction, and this is what poetry has done. I'm going to carry that red wheelbarrow with me because I still don't figure out how the red wheelbarrow and the white chicken meet. So I'm going to carry that with me, and I think a lot many people will. So we've seen poetry from different perspectives, from different cultures, from different languages. And the connecting thing is the poetics or kavya tattva. And I think that is what we will carry home today. Thank you very much for being with us. And it's been a pleasure. And I hope we can continue these kind of dialogues over a period of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Urvi?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir. It has been a really great privilege for me, especially to share space with you both and to hear you all from such knowledgeable persons. And I'm really sure it made every one of the viewers ponder upon to how to read a poem, to think deeply within us, how to interpret the message of a poem. And on behalf of Dr. Manu Kothari, Chair of Medical Humanities at SAIT GSMC, we express our gratitude towards you, sir, for taking out your time and sharing your immense views. Also, I would like to thank Dr. Karthik, sir, for his thoughts, our Dean, Dr. Hemant Deshmukh, sir, and Academic Dean, Dr. Milind Natkar, sir, for their support, uh, for Dr. Padmaja Samant, ma'am, Dr. Lopa Mehta, ma'am, Dr. Sunil Pandya, sir, and all the other committee members of Medical Humanities for always showing their support to us and encouraging us, and the student team of Medical Humanities, and the audience as well for being so encouraging, for listening us, and I'm sure that would be so much to take away from the event, how to read a poem. So thank you so much, sir.